Very good. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar around Oracle Unlimited License Agreements. How does this work? My name is Richard Spithoven. I'm one of the managing partners of ULA, a software license management company working with a lot of different customers across the globe, supporting them in their challenges with software publishers like Oracle, IBM, Microsoft, SAP, and many, many more. And today, during today's sessions, we're going to talk about one of my most favorite topics, being Oracle, and more particularly, Oracle Unlimited License Agreements. During this session, we have reserved enough time to raise any questions you may have. So if at the end of the session you do have any questions, we will definitely make sure that we can address all your questions. But if you, while I'm presenting to you the content of today, do have any questions, feel free to raise your question in the QA section of the webinar, because at the end of the webinar, we will go through all the individual questions that have been raised and answer everything you wanted to know about Oracle Unlimited License Agreements. So that is an introduction for today's session. Let's talk about ULAs and what a ULA is actually all about. Because although the name says that an unlimited license agreement is unlimited, an unlimited license agreement is actually not that unlimited at all. Because as a standard, an unlimited license agreement is a time-based license agreement from Oracle Corporation providing an unlimited use for a limited or a subset of Oracle programs. So although the name unlimited may think or may people believe that you can use whatever you want, there are a number of limitations that you should be aware of before, during, or after you enter into a ULA from Oracle. If we look at the term of a ULA, then typically the term of the ULA is in a period from 1 to 5 years. So that means you can have an unlimited license agreement for the period of 1 year, for the period of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or 5 years. But also since approximately 1.5 to 2 years, Oracle also has a different flavor in terms of the term of the ULA, and that is a perpetual ULA, or a so-called PULA, in which Oracle grants the perpetual, so never-ending, unlimited deployment right for a number of products that are part of the contract. So there is always a term which is typically between 1 to 5 years, and sometimes the most expensive term. Oracle also offers a perpetual ULA in terms of a ULA contract. In terms of the different products that can be part of a ULA, in essence, almost all the Oracle programs that Oracle has, which are more than 250,000 different products, can become part of the ULA. So that can be database, middleware, business intelligence, e-business suite, Primavera, Siebel, Hyperion, and so on. In essence, all the Oracle programs that you can think of can become part of a ULA. But quite often you see that a limited license agreement is typically restricted to the so-called technology programs from Oracle, being that it is only database options, and database management packs, or in combination with the middleware products like the Logic Suite, or business intelligence program like Business Intelligence Server Enterprise Edition Plus. So in principle, all the products can be part of the ULA, but quite often it is limited to technology products. And from an unlimited license agreement perspective, you can have also, in terms of the number of licenses you have or that you are allowed to deploy, you can have a real unlimited deployment right, which means you can deploy as many of the licenses as you want during the term of the ULA for specific products. That is a so-called uncapped or a real unlimited license agreement. But Oracle has a so-called flavor, which they call a capped ULA. And in a capped ULA, the number of licenses that you're allowed to deploy is capped to a maximum number of licenses. So for example, Oracle would be allowed, or would be possible, to provide you a ULA proposal in which they give you the limited deployment right for 2 years for the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition, but it is capped up to a maximum of 2,000 processors, meaning that there is a cap, which means you need to respect. So if you would deploy more than those 2,000 processors, then at that moment in time, you're breaching the cap, and you would actually need to buy additional licenses in order to be correctly licensed. So term can be from 1 to 5 years, but typically the last 2 years, you see a lot of push to move also into a perpetual ULA. It can be for almost all the programs. It can be for an unlimited quantity or a capped quantity. And those are the three major characteristics that you see in a ULA. But what happens with your existing licenses? Because let's say you would have an unlimited license agreement for the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition, but before you enter into that unlimited license agreement, you bought a lot of database licenses separately. You bought X amount of processor licenses for the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition, or X amount of Named User Plus licenses for the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition. Now, all those existing licenses that you bought, all the existing licenses that you bought are actually converted and replaced into the ULA, which means that the support fees that you're paying for the licenses for those products that are part of the ULA are actually terminated, and the support maintenance fees that you contracted for to pay towards Oracle for those licenses are actually converted and rolled into the so-called total support stream. So with a ULA, you're actually terminating your individual database contracts in my example, and that support stream that is related to those individual database contracts becomes one big total support stream that is part of the ULA. That is an important thing to keep in mind, because before you enter into such a ULA, it actually then means that you may have had, let's say, 10 or 15 separated orders with separate CSI numbers that the moment that you start going into a ULA are no longer existing. Now you may think, why is that an issue? Well, the issue in there is that if you had, in my example, 10 or 15 contracts before you entered into the ULA, then you still had the opportunity to individually cancel the support maintenance of those licenses that had separate CSI numbers, because every single order had their own CSI number. The moment that the licenses are rolled into the ULA, it becomes one big support stream, and therefore reducing your support stream once you entered into the ULA is going to be more difficult than before, where you had the opportunity to individually determine per contract to cancel the support. Now, apart from that, you need to be aware that an unlimited license agreement is always limited to a number of legal entities, and that is always defined in the so-called customer definition of the ULA. Why is that important? Because in essence, all the legal entities that are typically included as an exhibit of the ordering documents, only those legal entities are allowed to make use of the software. And the contracting entity is responsible for making sure that all those legal entities that are listed in the unlimited license agreement do respect the terms and conditions of the contract, because the contracting entity takes that responsibility and is responsible for making sure that all those legal entities that are defined in the contract are respecting the terms and conditions of the contract. Now, apart from that, you need to be aware that only those legal entities that are listed are allowed to make use of the software programs. But that can create issues, because typically you see that it includes only your majority-owned subsidiaries, like your ultimate parent or your IT legal entity is the contracting entity. And then from the ultimate parent, all the subsidiaries, the majority-owned subsidiaries, are listed into the agreement and therefore allowed to make use of the software. But you see quite often that larger organizations may also have minority-owned subsidiaries or joint ventures or legal entities with voting rights, which are not a majority-owned subsidiary of your ultimate parent, but may require the rights to make use of the software as well. So when you enter into a ULA, you need to have a clear view of all the legal entities that should be listed into your customer definition, because if it's not listed, then it by definition means that that legal entity is not allowed to make use of the software. Now, apart from that, like we said, there is a limitation in terms of the specific products that are listed into the ULA ordering documents, because only those specific products that are part of the ULA ordering documents are allowed to be used under this unlimited license agreement. Now, what a lot of people do not always realize themselves is that even if you have an Oracle program that is technically related to an Oracle program that is listed into the ULA, or if an Oracle program is shipped or downloaded with the Oracle programs that are listed in the ULA, that doesn't mean that you're allowed to make use of those programs. So let's have a look at an example. So let's say you as an end user have a ULA for the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition, Diagnostic Pack, Tuning Pack, and Partition. Now you may then think, oh, I have the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition. That is the highest database edition version that Oracle has available. So I should also be allowed to make use of Oracle Database Personal Edition, Standard Edition, or Standard Edition 2, the newest product from Oracle from that perspective. So although those databases are technically related to the Enterprise Edition database, if your contract doesn't specify that you're allowed to make use of those lower database editions, by definition, you're not allowed to make use of those database editions. And as such, you always need to make sure that you have specific language in your contract that makes sure that you are, if you have an Enterprise Edition database as part of your ULA, you're also allowed to make use of the lower database editions. Now, next to that, you may all be familiar with the fact that if you download the Oracle database from Oracle itself, you all get those database options installed automatically, like multi-tenant, view application clusters, and all the other database options and management packs that Oracle automatically installs when you are installing the standard database Enterprise Edition. Now, although those different features and components are part of your standard database installation, since they are not specified into a ULA, you are not allowed to make use of those products. Maybe as a nice anecdote, I had one customer 2-3 years ago that had a ULA, and at that moment in time, they bought a ULA for all the Oracle technology programs. Then they certified their ULA, and around a year or two later, Oracle started to do an audit. And at that moment in time, the auditors found that the customer was actually making use of advanced compression. And the customer called me and said, Richard, it can't be true. We did a technology ULA for all the database options and management packs that Oracle had available. So it can't be that we're using something that there's actually not part of their contract. But what this customer didn't really keep in mind is that while Oracle made newer database versions available, Oracle also started to make newer database options and management packs available. And they were not aware that the ULA that they entered into 4 years ago indeed was at that moment in time covering all the technology programs that Oracle had available. But since the technology developed further and Oracle made other options and features available that were separately licensable, there was actually still a big compliance issue. So although you may think I have an unlimited license agreement for a large amount of those products, it is only for those that are specified in your contract. And anything that is not specified or may become available at a later stage, by definition, is not something that you are allowed to make use of. Now, like I said in the beginning, you also have, apart from that product condition, which can be restricted to a limited amount of products, you also have a condition in which the number of licenses that you're allowed to use is capped to a certain maximum. Like I said, 100 processors, Oracle Database Enterprise Edition. But only if you have a so-called uncapped ULA, in which you have the real unlimited deployment rights to make use of an unlimited amount of installations of those specific programs, then you would typically start talking about a real unlimited license agreement. But be aware that a combination of such a cap and an uncapped number of licenses for different Oracle programs can be part of one and the same ordering document. So a clear study of your unlimited license agreement to understand what you are and what you are not allowed to do is really important to do. Now, quite often I do get a question from customers and saying, Richard, what is the price of a ULA? What should we be paying for a ULA based upon this and this and this? Now, first of all, it should be really clear that there is no price list for ULAs. There is always a black box calculation made by Oracle on what the pricing is going to be for a ULA. But there are a number of parameters that are taken into account in order to determine the price that a customer is paying for the ULA. First of all, the more programs you include into the ULA, the more value you can get from Oracle, and therefore the price is higher. A ULA for only the database is therefore cheaper than a ULA for the database, diagnostic pack tuning, partitioning, and advanced compression, for example. So the number of Oracle programs that are part of the ULA is one parameter. The second parameter is the term of the ULA. Is it 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, or maybe even perpetual? The longer the term, the more value you can get out of the ULA, the higher the price. But apart from those two rather obvious parameters, Oracle also looks into the investments that you have made in the specific Oracle programs that you want to make part of the ULA. Because if we're, for example, talking about a ULA for the database, and Oracle sees that over the last 5 years, on average, you spend $500K per year in new database licenses, their expectation is that that average number of licenses and the fees related to it will be something that you would be paying anyways over the next period of time as well. That is what they call your normal install base and demand that may be growing as a result of that. So your historical purchase behavior is another parameter that Oracle looks at, combined obviously with what your current and future demand may be. Because of course, if there is knowledge at Oracle that you're going to virtualize your whole estate in VMware, or you're planning to start making use memory and database cache or advanced compression, or you have specific situations in your organization in which you're going to transform to Amazon or to Azure, which results in the fact that you will have a period of time of double usage, because while you're migrating to the public cloud, on-prem and in the cloud, you will have double installations, meaning double license requirements. All those parameters that actually have an impact on what Oracle would call the future demands, together with the other parameters that I just mentioned, are taken into account by Oracle in order to determine the price. And based upon that, I've seen ULAs for smaller customers of, let's say, 500k euros, but I've also seen ULAs of customers paying 80 million euros and everything in between. So the size of the company, the real number of programs in the ULA, the term of the ULA, your historical purchasing behavior, and your future outlook, all those parameters determine the price that you are paying for a ULA. Now, there are, of course, by knowing how it works, a number of situations that you need to be aware of, and where you should actually start thinking about to see how you address that contractually. Because, of course, we just seen that the ULA is restricted to a number of legal entities. But what happens when I acquire legal entities? Because, by definition, a legal entity that is acquired during the term of the ULA is not allowed to make use of the Oracle ULA programs, simply because of the fact that that legal entity is not listed into your agreements. Now, if you do not have specific language in your contract that allows you to have such an acquired entity make use of your ULA programs, which is something that you can negotiate as a non-standard clause, there are two options. You can still submit a request towards Oracle to make sure that that legal entity is to be allowed to make use of software, but then typically Oracle, if it would approve it, will require you to roll in the support maintenance of those licenses of the acquired entity into your ULA, so your total support stream will increase, or Oracle just doesn't approve it and wants to see money use of the ULA as well by issuing an amendment. Now, make sure that civic letter, for example, there is also another situation, because if you have an unlimited deployment right, you would want to make sure, in case you divest a legal entity, that the moment that that legal entity is being divested, that you do have a certain grace period in place. Because in practice, what means, maybe today an entity is going to be divested, but it takes your organization time to disentangle the divested entity of your IT infrastructure. And especially for larger organizations, having a period of 6 months to a year is already rather short, in order to make sure that it is practically possible to make sure that that divested entity is completely not making use of your IT infrastructure at all. So make sure that in case you are considering a ULA, that you do have divestiture language into your agreement, because if you don't have that, then actually it means that the moment that you divest an entity, the new owner of the divested entity would be responsible for making sure that they are licensing their usage on your infrastructure. Apart from that, you would want to make sure that in case you are in a ULA and you are divesting an entity, that divested entity may do a so-called partial certification in order to certify its then current usage of your software programs. That gives you two options. First of all, to make sure that you're able to assign licenses to the new owner, although you have an unlimited deployment right. But second, it gives you also the opportunity to divest support maintenance fees that you may want to deduct from your total support stream. So that is another situation where you really need to keep an eye on to make sure that you're not going to have issues at the later stage. Now, what happens then at the end of the ULA? So let's say we enter into a ULA for 2 to 3 years. Now, actually, you do have two different options. You can either renew the ULA, which means you negotiate a new contract with Oracle, where you will need to pay new license and support fees for the same programs, for another set of programs, for a subset of the programs that you entered into the initial ULA, which can be the same term, a smaller term, a longer term. It can be for other products. So all the flavors that we've just seen are then still possible. But the old ULA support stream is rolled into the new ULA. So you need to be really careful if you are renewing your ULA to determine, okay, what is the bill of materials, meaning what products are we going to continue into the ULA, and how are we going to make sure that the support stream from our initial ULA is going to be separated out from the new ULA, because otherwise your support stream, your annual cost, will only increase and increase and increase. Now, the other option you have is that you are declaring and certifying your usage towards Oracle, because as part of your contract, there is a certification clause which requires you to determine at the end of the ULA your then current deployment and usage of the Oracle programs. And based upon whatever number of licenses you have deployed at that moment in time, Oracle will assign perpetual licenses towards your install base. So that's what you're allowed to use going forward. And there is no requirement to pay a true-up license fee. You just continue to pay the total support stream as you did before, subject to support indexation, if not negotiated differently. So different than, for example, with Microsoft, where sometimes people are confused with where you may need to pay a true-up fee. It is actually in your interest as an end user to make sure that you accelerate and deploy as many of the Oracle programs that are part of the ULA so that you can certify the highest amount of licenses at the end of the ULA. Certifying high and then consolidating to make sure that you create a surplus number of licenses that are available for the future, or which can be used to start cutting cost in the future going forward, is therefore typically the recommended strategy for customers to follow. Now, how does that then look? If you look at the standard certification clause, such a certification clause says that on the X anniversary of the agreement, so after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years, or 5 years, you do need to follow the so-called certification process. And in that certification process, you do have a period of 30 days in which you need to follow that steps that I just said. You, as an end user, are required to provide Oracle a certification of the then current number of licenses, being processors. Typically, we're talking about technology programs, but it can also be application users or any other metric that has been agreed, on which the Oracle programs are installed and running. Now, that is an important thing to keep in mind, because as you may know, Oracle typically requires you to license the software once it is installed and or running. From a certification perspective, Oracle allows you only to certify the Oracle programs that are installed and running. Now, what does that mean? That means that you need to be able to count all the software that is installed and used, and where that usage is actually triggered by yourself. So, for example, usage of database options like partitioning or advanced compression by the out-of-the-box database installation itself, like, for example, usage of partitioning by a user called sys or sh or sysman, such usage is not initiated by you as an end user, and therefore not allowed to be included into your certification, because only the programs that are installed and running or in use as done by yourself are allowed to be counted and certified. And in order to make sure that there is a certain level of trust in the numbers that you supply towards Oracle, Oracle will require you that that certification is signed off by a C-level representative of your organization. Now, whenever you certify, of course, you can have a situation that you are initially thinking when you start a ULA, we think we're going to deploy in the next 3 years a total amount of 1,000 processors. But sometimes we see that customers actually do change their strategy completely. There's a new CIO, or there is a complete project that completely fails. And although everybody initially expected that there were 1,000 processors going to be deployed and certified at the end of the ULA, in the end, it turns out to be only 20. Now, of course, that is a risky situation, because in that situation, it actually would mean that you're only allowed to certify 20 processors. Now, in order to accommodate that, Oracle has a possibility to include a so-called certification floor in your agreement. And that is a non-standard term through which you can make sure that Oracle at all times grants you a minimum amount of licenses at the end of the ULA. So in my situation, in which you initially thought you're going to deploy 1,000, but you actually deploy 20, you would actually be able to say in such a certification floor, at all times, we will not certify less than, let's say, 600 processors. So if you have a new ULA, it is always recommended to have such a certification floor as part of your agreement to avoid that you are in a situation in which the number of licenses is going to be really small that you can certify at the end of the ULA. Now, what are the issues or what are the gotchas that you need to be aware of? Now, first of all, if you start certifying your ULA, you need to make sure that you really start on time, because a lot of people underestimate how much time is needed in order to do this accurately. Based upon my experience, it is typically 3 to 6 months is not a small period of time for large organizations in order to really gather all the data that is needed in order to have all the numbers in a complete and accurate manner ready. If you start too late, it actually means that you're not able to actually comply with your contractual requirements to certify within 30 days at the end of the ULA. And as such, you therefore may create a situation in which Oracle actually has leverage to push you over to a new ULA. And if you do it under time pressure and you do not have all the clear deployment and usage data ready, it therefore can typically mean into two different situations that you end up with. First of all, it can be that you certify a lower amount of licenses that you're using than what actually the reality is. Meaning that if you have actually 1,000 processes deployed, but you didn't count correctly because of the time pressure, and therefore you only certified let's say 80% of it, then obviously you actually create a compliance issue yourself for 20% of your deployments the moment you certify. Or you may certify a higher number than what you're actually really using. And if you do that, and Oracle starts doing an audit in order to validate if your numbers are correct, Oracle will see this as a sign of fraud under international and local intellectual property laws, meaning that they will use this as a leverage towards your C-level to claim that you actually have played fraud, and therefore we better start talking about doing a new deal. So really make sure that you start on time and have your act together, because either you create a compliance issue for yourself, or you may create a situation in which Oracle is actually going to push your C-level in order to step into another ULA. And let's not forget, if you do miss your obligation to certify on time, in principle, that is a breach of your contract, where Oracle could take the position, ultimately, that your ULA is actually going to be certified against 0 licenses. So please, please, please start on time and ask for help in case you need help to do this in a complete and accurate manner. Because what do we see quite often where it does go wrong? All the legal entities that are listed in your license agreement should be included into your certification. But what happened with your legal entity structure during the term of the ULA? Legal entities may have changed because of organizational changes. Legal entities may have been divested. Legal entities may have been acquired. Legal entities may have been completely disappeared to exist. So keeping track of the legal entities and how they develop during the term of the ULA is absolutely important to make sure that you have a clear view of what legal entities should be part of your certification. Next to that, don't forget that during your certification, you should look at all your data centers of your organization. Now, that may sound very obvious, but you would be surprised how many customers actually forget that they have a small outsourcing company as well, where they deploy Oracle databases on your behalf, which may be deployed on a virtual VMware environment, causing a lot of compliance issues if you do not include those into your certification. So all the devices being in-house or outsourced on which the Oracle software is installed and running, used for your business operations, should be taken into account. And make sure that all your devices are included in there, because sometimes we see customers that think that only your production environment should be included. But don't forget, at the end of the ULA, you should have sufficient licenses to cover your total usage of those programs. You should be compliant at the end of the ULA. So it should include as well your test, development, acceptance, production, disaster recovery, Sandbox, and any other environments that you may have in your organization on which the Oracle programs are installed and running. And make sure that you only include during your whole data gathering process the programs that are part of your ULA. Now, you may think, well, Richard, that's rather obvious. Why should we actually collect more information? But the reason why I'm saying that is that there are a lot of companies that also engage the Oracle LMS organization, my former department, to support them in gathering all the data for their certification. Now, what you should be aware is that the scripts that Oracle LMS would use, the so-called LMS collection tool, is not only collecting information for the Oracle programs that are part of your ULA. Those scripts actually collect information for all the different products that you may deploy on your environment. And therefore, it may also collect information of unlicensed database options, management packs, or other software components that you may have installed on your estate. So if you start to decide to not do it yourself or with the help of companies like yourselves, and you would want to engage with the LMS organization, make sure that you do have a clear view of what specific data elements are actually being collected, because if you don't do that, you may share deployment and usage information towards Oracle, which are actually something you wouldn't want, because if that includes information about programs you're not licensed for, that actually will result in a compliance claim from Oracle. And don't forget, a lot of those programs are shipped and downloaded with the ULA programs itself, like the database. So this is a big risk that you may be facing. Now, like I said, in your certification, you need to look at installed and running. And that is a deviation from the standard rule where Oracle says installed and or running. So the reason why Oracle deviates from that is they would want to avoid that before the end of the ULA, you're actually going to, for example, install an Oracle database on all the desktops and laptops within your organization, because that would actually result in possibly pumping up the number of licenses that you can certify at the end of the ULA. Oracle wants to avoid that you're just going to install the software everywhere and then pump up the numbers. You only are allowed to certify the software that you actually have in operational use. But you need to be aware that the whole running thing that Oracle includes in their contract is not defined to your agreements, because when is the software program running? When is it being used? That information is different per program. For example, if you talk about database options, you can see if an option or advanced compression or any of the other options are actually in use. But if it is operational use triggered by yourself, that requires deep inside knowledge of experts to understand if that usage is actually licensable usage and therefore also something that you can include into your certification. Because be aware, system usage, so usage of products that is triggered by the software itself, is not allowed to be included into your ULA certification. Now, what we see in there, if you start counting the number of processors that you want to certify, then obviously it is really important that you count correctly. And again, that may sound really easy and very obvious that that needs to happen, but you would be surprised that a lot of people still make mistakes in there. Because if you have, for example, a ULA for database, middleware, and BI, and you are required to certify, you need to be aware that you need to count as per Oracle's processor definition. Now, the counting of processors, which is referring to the definition of a processor, that's why it's listed in your contract with a capital P, needs to be taken into account in order to determine how to count processors. And that sounds very simple, but if you look at the processor definition that Oracle applies today, it does say you need to look at the number of cores of the physical servers on which the software is installed, and that number then needs to be multiplied with a core factor that is listed in a document, the so-called Oracle Processor Core Factor table. Now, that may be different per contract, so you always need to look at your contract to see what is actually being defined there. Because a lot of people think, oh, yeah, it's Intel, so Intel has a core factor of 0.5, so yeah, 4 cores times 0.5 is 2 processors that I need to count. But people typically tend not to look into the details of the processor core factor table and then come to the conclusion that if, for example, you're using an Intel CPU, but it's still a single core processor, the factor for that is not 0.5, but actually 1, resulting in a situation that if you do not check your details as per the processor core factor table, you may result in a situation that you do not count correctly, resulting in a compliance issue for yourself. Apart from that, the processor definition, of course, doesn't say anything around how to count the number of licenses in virtual environments. But if you are talking about deployments of Oracle on VMware, which is still the major virtualization technology that companies use, then you need to be aware that Oracle's standard licensing rules also need to be applied for a certification, which means if you're deploying Oracle on VMware, then in principle, all the physical cores of all the ESX hosts that are part of the clusters, data centers, and vCenter instances on which the software is deployed are required to be included. That means that also from a pumping up the numbers in terms of certification, Oracle's licensing rules around VMware can be used in your benefit. Because as you may know, Oracle requires from VMware vSphere version 6.0 to count all the physical cores of all the physical hosts of all the clusters of all the data centers of all the vCenter instances that are running on version 6 as long as the ESX host version is 5.1 or higher. So all your vCenter instances would need to be taken into account. A situation that typically is applicable today because the older versions of vSphere are no longer under support from VMware. Now, of course, that is a great opportunity in order to pump up the numbers, but at the same time, that also causes a risk because let's say you may be able, as a result of this, to certify 100,000 processors. At the same time, if you or your outsourcing company after certification adds more physical service to your vCenters, it also creates rather easily a non-compliance issue. So having a strategy in which you certify the max, but also, for example, obtain non-standard language from Oracle, which allows you to count on a cluster level, a so-called SAN segregation approval, would be part of your strategy that you should think of before you start certifying. Because only looking at the short term and maximizing the number of licenses without having a strategy on what you're going to do with your VMware deployments is a rather risky situation you would want to avoid. Now, another example is, for example, LPARS, IBM LPARS, because again, your processor definition says count the number of cores and then multiply it with a factor, and then you know the number of processors that you need to certify. But different as what we've seen for VMware, in which you need to count the whole VMware infrastructure, Oracle has different rules again around a virtualization technology like LPARS. Because in an LPAR, Oracle requires you to look at the specific configuration of the logical partition from IBM in order to determine what you're allowed to count and therefore what you're allowed to include into your certification. Think, for example, about LPARs that are capped or uncapped. With a dedicated entitled capacity, a capped LPAR, you would need to look at the entitled capacity that is part of that LPAR. But if you have an LPAR that is part of a shared pool in which different LPARs can make use of a pool of cores that are available for those different LPARs, you would need to look at the configuration of that pool to determine how many cores you need to count. So something that looks really easy if you look at that initial processor definition where it says count the number of cores multiplied by a factor and you know the number of processors, is for a lot of different hardware configuration scenarios something you should look into much more detail in order to understand that you count correctly and to avoid that you are certifying too much, which is a risk from a commercial perspective, or to certify lower, which actually results in a situation that you are making yourself out of compliance straight away. And then last, but definitely not to least, what about your deployments on public clouds? Because a lot of companies are now transforming from their on-premise deployments to public cloud environments like Amazon EC2, Amazon S3, or RDS, Microsoft Windows Azure. And what do you think? Well, if you look at Oracle's licensing Oracle software in the cloud computing environment policy, Oracle nicely says in their policies that you are allowed to deploy the Oracle programs that are contracted to you by a ULA. Well, what does that contract or that policy actually say as well? It also says that you are not allowed to certify your deployments on the public cloud. So let's think about that for a moment. If we would follow Oracle's policies, then let's say you have, at the end of the ULA, you have 1,000 processes deployed. And let's say 600 processes are deployed on-prem and 400 processes are deployed on Amazon EC2. If you follow Oracle's policies, Oracle actually says you're allowed to certify the 600, but the 400 you're actually not allowed to certify. What does that mean? That means that you would actually then certify 600. But the moment that you certify, you still have those 400 deployments in Amazon EC2. So here you see, and this is a licensing policy that Oracle publishes online and is not contractually binding because that's an educational document. But still, here you see that Oracle's policies are there designed to make sure that you would be in a situation that you would easy move to another ULA renewal, because this is their standard position. So if you're entering into a new ULA or you're considering to move to a new ULA, you should really think about the non-standard language that you would want to put into your contract that allows you to certify the number of virtual cores or virtual CPUs that you're consuming in public cloud providers like Amazon, Azure, Google, Alibaba, IBM Clouds, or call out all the other public cloud vendors that we nowadays have to make sure that you have clear rules around that. Because if you don't have them in your contract, you for sure will end up into an issue. So some recommendations to wrap up this story, and then we will go to the questions that are being raised. If you are considering a ULA, what is my best recommendation that I can give you? First of all, make sure that you get clarity on your current entitlements and deployment and determine what your current demand and expected growth is going to be. Because based upon that, you can consider if a ULA indeed is a very good commercial solution for you and what your negotiation strategy should be, or it gives you the clarity on the fact that a ULA may not be such a good option because you're actually locking in all your support for the next period of time, and actually it is completely not helping you for the future to save costs. If you do have a ULA, I really recommend you to do a midterm assessment at the midterm of the ULA, because that moment in time, you will get a detailed assessment of what you're deploying at that moment in time, but you still can also evaluate what is the real return of investment of the financial value that you've paid for the ULA at that moment in time. And if you see that certain products are, for example, not deployed as much as you thought at the start of the ULA, or you see that certain products are not even being deployed at all, then that means that you still have the time to further accelerate your deployments in your organization so that you're eligible to certify more. Or if certain products are completely not going to be used anymore, build your negotiation strategy on how to get rid of the associated support for the programs that you're actually not using, but for which you paid money, because that is the basis of your commercial negotiation. So determine what actions can be taken to optimize and maximize the value before the end term of the ULA is really something I would recommend you to do, because then you still have the time. Are you at the end of the ULA and you are up for certification? My overall recommendations are make sure that you start preparing your certification at least 6 months before the ULA ends. Because if you don't do that, you definitely have an issue in terms of time. And time is of the essence at that moment that you really need to do it in a proper way. Make sure that you involve your legal department, your IT department, database administrators, infrastructure managers, and business application managers to make sure that you have a complete view of the legal entities that should be part of the certification, the data centers and the servers that should be included into the certification, and what specific programs are required to be measured and to determine when the programs are installed and running. And obviously, in case you need help, because you should definitely not underestimate the level of expertise that you need, engage license management firms like ourselves to support you during such a certification. Because you don't want to be in a situation that you either certify too less or too much, or that you don't have a clear view of what the real deployment and usage data says, resulting in a situation that you're facing a risk that you are either not certifying correctly or submitting data towards Oracle, which actually may possibly disclose you from a compliance perspective. So that was the presentation that I prepared for today. I'm right on time because we have 15 minutes left, so I will open the floor and see what questions have been raised. There is one question from Asas I see where it is stated, what is a C-level representative? Well, a C-level representative can be a chief information officer a chief financial officer, your chief executive officer, so CEO, CFO, CIO, somebody from executive management from your organization. That person should sign off on the final certification, because Oracle wants to make sure that that person does its internal due diligence to validate if the numbers that are being submitted towards Oracle are complete and accurate, and therefore they require that signature of that C-level. Also, to make sure that in case the certification is not done properly, they can keep that person responsible for the fact that actually that person may either have over-certified and therefore apply fraud under international IP laws, or being under-certified and therefore also the conversation person and the person Oracle would want to have a conversation with in order to talk about how this is going to be commercially resolved. So I hope that answers your question, Azaz. So CIO, CFO, CEO, those are the typical C-level representatives where Oracle would refer to. There is another question from David. When a customer quit from a ULA, is he obliged to continue paying the support for all the certified licenses or may stop paying it? During the term of the ULA, the standard language from Oracle requires you to continue to pay the support maintenance fees, because if you do not pay your support maintenance during the term of the ULA, you will lose your unlimited deployment right. So that is a requirement from Oracle, that they only grant you the unlimited deployment right if you continue to pay support. At the end of the ULA, you are having the option to renew the support or to stop paying the support. Because then your certified number that comes out of the ULA is just one CSI with one total support stream. And that is a normal support renewal as you would have for any other license that you purchase from Oracle. Obviously, if you decide to not renew the support from Oracle after your ULA, you need to be aware of the fact that that means that you don't have technical support, but you're also giving up the right to make use of any software updates, bug fixes, or patches that Oracle makes available after the date until you've paid support maintenance. Of course, there is always an option, especially for companies that are phasing out Oracle, to look for third-party support vendors like Rimini Street or Spinnaker as an alternative solution provider to provide technical support. But such technical support is limited to, let's say, bright people with technical knowledge to help you with your issues. Those third-party support vendors are not allowed to provide any bug fixes or patches from the customer. Bug fixes or patches from Oracle, because that rights are only being granted by Oracle. So Rimini Street or anyone else is not allowed to provide that. Let me see if we have any other questions at this moment in time. Here we go. Can a ULA cover Java 2 or Java must be counted separately? A ULA is typically not including Java, simply because of the fact that the Java rights are being provided by a so-called unlimited subscription agreement. So you may be aware of the fact that in the past, Oracle had separate normal licenses for Java, being Java Standard Edition, Java Standard Edition Advanced. Oracle has taken them from their price list, so they're no longer selling normal licenses for Java. They moved that into a subscription model. So we do see historically customers that had a ULA for Java, but nowadays let's say similar type of agreement for Java is a so-called a limited subscription agreement, where you pay a lump sum fee per year towards Oracle for the rights to make use of Java. Then there is a question from Rudolph about what if the database option is installed and running but not in use? That requires how you look at the definitions of installed and running but not in use. And that is a very interesting discussion that you can have around that. Of course, if you have a database installed, then typically those database options are installed with the database itself as well. And you could, from a technical perspective, reason that the moment that a database option is installed and the database is mounted, so the database is running, then those database options are running as well. And therefore, I've seen situations in which customers said, I may not be using the option, but the option is installed on a database that is mounted and therefore running. So therefore, I consider all the installed options to be running as well. Now, from a technical perspective, that is absolutely right. From a licensing perspective, that is something that Oracle doesn't agree upon. Because from an Oracle licensing perspective, what they would require or what they would see as running or usage is if you actually started to use functionally a specific database option yourself. And how does Oracle do that? If you look at the different database options, then you may be familiar on the fact that the program documentation specifies for a lot of those options that there is specific usage, standard out of the box usage of, for example, partitioning, which is not triggered by you as an end user, but by the standard installation of the database. Now, such usage of partitioning, like I said, sys or sysmin or sh, that is using a predefined partition table is not considered to be running or usage by Oracle, which means that that would then requires to be separately counted and certified. Only the usage that is triggered by yourself, so not in my example sys, sysmin, or sh, would be required to be included into your certification. I hope that answers your question, Rudolf. If not, then just let me know. Then I have another question from Yavidur. How does it work for education NGOs? In principle, the principles that I've been talking about during this session are similar for education and NGOs as well. It may be that you do have for an education or an NGO a separate type of agreement. Like, for example, there are agreements that I'm familiar with where there is an unlimited license agreement based upon the number of students within a university or the number of employees. And then the number that you need to certify is not based on counting the number of processors, but is based on the number of students or employees that you have at the end of the term of the ULA. So there can be deviations from the standard processor counts, but that really depends on your contract. There is not a standard ULA type of agreement for educational customers or NGOs, but I am familiar with the fact that Oracle may make deviations from that by moving to, for example, a student count or an employee count. That is always depending on what has been commercially negotiated. Let me see. Are there any other questions for now? I don't see any other questions for now, so let me just give it one more minute to see if there are any other questions from anyone else. I have here another question from Azaz, where the question is it true that if the support expired in 2017 and I want to renew it in 2019, Oracle will calculate the support charges for 2018 as well? Yes, that's correct, Azaz. So if you would have if you would have decided in 2017 to not renew your support, and in 2019 you decide to renew it, then Oracle will apply a so-called reinstatement fee calculation, in which for the previous period, so in your example from 2017 to 2018 and from 2018 to 2019, Oracle will calculate what you should have paid if you would have renewed your support and apply a penalty of 150%. That is the so-called reinstatement fee that Oracle publishes in their so-called Oracle Technical Support Policies. And they are published online on oracle.com/support. So yes, that is correct. Oracle will charge you for the intermediate period as well. Then there's another question I see from Rudolf. Which Oracle legal doc supports the rule that ESX 6.0 plus requires all CPUs in all clusters? There is no legal doc from Oracle that specifies it like that. So from an Oracle perspective, or from an Oracle legal perspective, you should be aware of the fact that a license agreement specifies the rights under which you're allowed to make use of the software. And in your license agreement, the processor definition will say you need to count all the cores of the servers on which the programs are installed and or running, referring to the physical CPUs as defined in the processor core factor table. So the only legal language that is part of your contract is the processor definition, referring to a online source being the processor core factor table, specifying the physical CPUs of the server on which the software can be installed and or running. Now, the moment that you're deploying VMware and you have a different view on how Oracle should count the number of licenses, it actually means that if you deploy Oracle on VMware and your contract doesn't say anything around counting it differently, then from an Oracle legal perspective, you should obtain permission from Oracle first before you can take a different stance than them. Now, in practice, that typically doesn't happen, right? Because people just start moving it and have their own interpretation. But from a legal perspective, Oracle only defines the processor definition in the core factor table online. Will Oracle ever go to court to enforce their position around licensing Oracle across all the vCenters if you're using version 6.0 or higher? No, because the reality is, if Oracle would want to enforce that, there is always a risk that Oracle will lose that in front of court. And that's what you've seen in a lot of different cases like Oracle versus Mars, but I'm also familiar with a lot of other cases where there has been legal discussions between end users and Oracle around this discussion. And that's also the reason why Oracle never would go to court in order to enforce their position in here. Because if there would be a chance that they would lose, that would create a precedence for the rest of the world. Now, from a pure contractual perspective, it however doesn't mean that if you feel you should count virtual cores, or if you feel that it is fair to count on a cluster level, or you feel that we should count in a completely different manner, that it's not up to you as an end user to decide to count differently, because Oracle is the owner of the IP and dictates the rules under which it is there. So that's also why I always recommend customers that are deploying Oracle on VMware to go through that non-standard, that sense segregation approval process in order to have clear contractual terms in your contracts where Oracle will allow you to count on a cluster level or on a data center level, depending on how you configure your VMware environment. And maybe to provide you a bit more details in there, how does such a sense segregation approval process work? That is not a process that Oracle publishes online, but it is a standard process that Oracle Legal, Oracle LMS have been developing internally within Oracle in order to get rid of this discussion around Oracle and VMware. And that process, in short, means that you would need to provide Oracle an IT architectural overview in which you show how on a network and on a storage level you are able and willing to ring fence your environment, meaning your storage would be ring fenced in such a way that you, for example, apply LUN masking, that only the specific servers, the physical servers that you intend to run the Oracle software, have access to the disks on which the software is installed. And from a network perspective, they would want to see that you are creating dedicated Oracle VLANs, for example, to make sure that your network is isolated as well. And in case you are willing to comply with that network isolation and storage isolation, Oracle will be able to validate if you're meeting those requirements in the case of an audit. If that happens, then you submit that, you provide the clarification. Oracle then would submit that towards their HQ. They will review that, and if it is being approved, you would get an amendment to your contract that specifies that as of that moment in time, to count the number of licenses on a cluster level is being approved, for example. I'm not defending Oracle in there, but I think we need to be aware that Oracle is the owner of the software. They dictate the rules. The contractual language in the contract is the processor definition referring to the processor core factor table. The fact that nothing has been agreed into your contract around VMware doesn't mean that the interpretation of the end user is the truth. And you should work with Oracle, for example, through such a non-standard sense segregation approval process to get the specific language in your contract that prevents you or protects you for counting across vCenters as long as a number of technical restrictions are being put in place. I think we're on the top of the hour. I'm not sure if there are any other questions. I don't think so. But in case there are any further questions, or if you would want to talk further with us around your ULAs or your ideas around ULAs, maybe you want to move into a ULA, you're still planning to do that before the end of May, or the end of fiscal year, or you need to certify your ULA, or you are in the middle of your ULA, you want to do a midterm assessment, feel free to reach out to us at info@belay.com, because we're more than happy to help you. Where we also have, if you do have an existing ULA, a very easy service for a lot of our customers. We call it a ULA health check, through which we help you to determine your risks that you're facing in your current ULA, but also the strategy that you should follow when you are going to go to the end of your ULA. Should you certify, should you renew, and what is the plan that you should follow? I hope that this was a useful session for everybody. Always happy to hear your feedback. Feel free to drop us an email to info@belay.com in case you have any needs for further support. And my team will definitely come back to you with a recording of the presentation and the presentation itself as a reference for you to further discuss internally if and when needed. So thanks a lot, everybody, for attending today's session. Again, I hope it was useful, and I wish you a lovely day.